Hello and welcome back to WeTalk San Francisco. We're here at Airbnb headquarters having a wonderful time. We have one more panel for you. We want to thank our founding sponsors at Dell who give us the tools to be our best as creators, and to our partners at Majority and Working Not Working and Interloper Films who have worked so hard to put this together. And after this, we're about to have some Impossible Burgers and have some Deep Eddy vodka and some Nomatica wine, which I think people are enjoying even during this. I'm not one of those people because I'm hosting the show. But let's cut to it. We're talking about women in tech. Women are still very much the minority. And in fact, I think it's like 24% of all computer science graduates are women, or even people that have computer science jobs, and that's down from 37% in 1995. So it's really interesting because you would think it would be going up, but it's going down. And only roughly 11% of the executive positions here in Silicon Valley are occupied by women, which is about the same percentage, I believe, of directors in the Directors Guild of America. So in my industry as a filmmaker, it's very much along those lines. And we have a fantastic group of fierce women that I'm going to introduce to you now to talk about this. Because in the wake of the Me Too movement, many of the front page stories are focused on harassment and wage disparity, and in tech startups as well. And the tide is turning, but there's a lot of effort, conscious effort that needs to be made towards that. So on the far end here, we have Adriana Gascoigne. Adriana is the founder and CEO of Girls in Tech, a San Francisco-based nonprofit organization devoted to empowering, educating, and engaging women in the tech industry across 60 chapters in 36 countries around the globe. No stranger to growing brands and building amazing companies, Adriana has worked with tech companies like Indiegogo, Oracle's Involver, and Change.org. She's also a Singularity University Impact Fellow Scholarship recipient and was named one of the 20 most influential Latinos in technology in 2018 by CNET. In the middle here, we have Sheila Warren, who's the head of blockchain and distributed ledger technologies practice for the World Economic Forum. I mean, okay, we need like an entire hour to unpack that. But she began her career as a Wall Street attorney before turning to philanthropy and nonprofit tech over a decade ago, has represented banks, philanthropists, and progressive nonprofits, also served as the VP of Strategic Alliances and General Counsel of TechSoup, the global social enterprise that has connected civil society organizations around the world with over $9 billion in donated tech-based resources. She previously designed and launched NGO Source, a groundbreaking service focused on international grant making, and created a blockchain-backed registry for nonprofit organizations around the world, and now heads the blockchain and distributed ledger technology team. Blockchain is the technology. I really feel like I need to define this for those of you who may not know, probably out there on the internet. I bet everybody in this, all the hundreds of people in this room know exactly what that is. But it is the technology behind the cryptocurrency Bitcoin. You've heard of that. We all should have invested a long time ago in that. And it is a digital distributed ledger on which transactions can be recorded securely, pseudonymously, and at the same time be open for anyone on the platform to see. So there's a new level of transparency that is opening everything. And more and more, our traditional financial outlets are starting to go, okay, this is real and it's here to stay. And you're looking at how it can benefit us. So I want to talk about that. McCray is no slouch, here to my right, PhD, and the interim director of diversity and belonging at Airbnb. And in this role, she leads company-wide initiatives to ensure that this company has an authentically diverse and inclusive community. And that's a lot harder than it sounds to make happen, because there's a lot of unconscious bias at work when we look at resumes. Even just the name alone can drive a lot of rejection that we don't even realize is happening. So you're up against that, and prior to joining the private sector, worked as a consultant helping organizations in a range of industries like Twitter, the New York Times, Pinterest, and GoPro, and had an 11-year tenure at Cornell University as the director of diversity. And when I said, why'd you leave Cornell? You're like, after 11 years?
self-explanatory.
I thought that was a great answer. I was like, okay, that makes sense. So welcome. So let's start down at the end again, Adriana. So you have brought a little bit of a video to explain what Girls in Tech really does. But more than anything, it's an empowerment engine. I had so much fun looking at this because, I don't know, it just made me feel good. So we'll check out about a minute of this.
I want to give it up to you guys for being here today. It really shows your commitment and dedication to your careers, to your personal development. So this is a very important event. We're a support community, and we make sure that women have role models and mentors locally and also globally.
So when you bring your whole self to what you're doing, you actually have so much more to give to people around you.
Instead of just finding yourself in the world as it is, you might find yourself in the world that you believe in, that you dreamed up and that you created.
Whenever you're doing something that's never been done before, if you're not constantly soliciting feedback, then you're not in a place to discover what you don't know.
For me, it's very important to give back, right? Because when I was growing up, I never had a role model, and I want to be the role model to those young generations.
I want to tell you how being yourself, being imperfect, you can absolutely rock a tech career.
It's a great time to be an entrepreneur, right? There are more venture funds than ever before.
One of the phrases we use is technically fearless. And what it means is that they don't look at something and saying, oh, that's too hard, we can't do that. They look at something and say, well, that's just a really hard problem, and I think I'm going to figure out how to solve it.
Leaders aren't afraid to bring people on the stage with them or send the elevator back down.
I'm also here for you that want to pursue a career in tech, don't want to be put in a box, don't want to be defined.
Thank you from the bottom of my heart for being here and for supporting Girls in Tech.
So how as a society are we lacking from not having ideas from women inside our companies and out?
Well, I think it starts off with the company culture and creating a culture that's really conducive to a productive and creative environment, and making it very comfortable for not only women, but people of diverse backgrounds, different minority groups, to really feel that they can be at their best without having to look behind their back or watch their backs. So I think it starts off with that. But in my experience working at several different startups, I realized that the diverse teams are better creative problem-solving teams. So they bring different solutions to the table because they've had different experiences. So if you speak a different language, have lived in a different country, different sexual preferences, it really provides a different perspective to building products and services, and you have different user behaviors and habits as a result. So having a more diverse team, you really create more comprehensive products and can be better creative problem solvers.
Yeah, I was discovered that in San Quentin Prison in this program called The Last Mile, where people who are in prison are coming up with startups, and the ideas that they have are addressing problems like diabetes, and things that their families have suffered from that we are not thinking about necessarily, or white men in hoodies are not thinking about here in Silicon Valley. But you had a powerful story we talked about. When you started out, you were in a startup as the only woman, and barely, you could have been hurt, physically hurt. You had like a water bottle thrown at your head. Tell us about that and what it was like for you versus now. What you would say to young women who are in environments that are somewhat aggressive.
Yeah, so I definitely had some interesting experiences. This was in 2006, 2007 timeframe, and I did get a full water bottle thrown at my head by someone who didn't understand the role of a product marketing executive, and said that I was talking too loudly, speaking to a reporter about the product. And he said, "Shut the F up," and threw the bottle at my head and nearly missed me, like literally by an inch. And then I went to talk to my supervisor, and he said, "You're being too sensitive." So that was probably the first week that I started. And then other things happened, like very inappropriate emails from people I didn't know, from men I didn't know on the engineering team. And I forwarded it to the attorney, and they said, "Come to my office right away. Our company can go under if anyone finds out about this." And I'm not a litigious person, so we worked it out. But just the culture, the environment, the way people interacted with me, it was an uphill battle. It was really me and my gay friend TJ, who were always in cahoots and would go to lunch together, and we'd talk about the situations that needed to change. And it was then that I started Girls in Tech, because I was inspired to bring a community of women who were interested in really thriving in the tech field, but didn't want to feel limited by their surroundings.
Well, with the computer science graduates and number of women heading down, can you explain that regarding like the double-edged sword that of sexual harassment cases rising, everybody speaking out, the Me Too movement, but then what is that doing? Is it a culture of fear that's being created? Like what's behind it?
Yeah, so I mean that is a really good point and a really good question. I think it's in great part due to alienation and isolation. And my best friend from childhood actually got her CS master's at Stanford, and she said that she had a lot of just really difficult experiences of people in her team or in the class, because there were 60 people and she was one of 3 women and the only Anglo female. And so people didn't want to be on her teams, on our projects. They didn't want to collaborate. They just wanted to hang out mostly with their male counterparts. And she felt very isolated and unable. She didn't know who to turn to for help. And she didn't have the ability to collaborate with folks effectively. And she said, well, hopefully this will change in the workplace. Now she's a firmware engineer at Tesla. And again, I think she's one of 2 out of a group of around 100 people, and she's still experiencing the same things. So I think that, well, one, it's very challenging and difficult, to achieve success at a school like Stanford and getting your CS masters. But 2, it is that isolationism, that alienation that you get as a female in that.
Okay, well, we'll come back to all that, and as a group, we're going to tackle that and do away with all of it as soon as we're done with everybody individually. Sheila, how does blockchain improve philanthropy? How can blockchain help us save this world that we live in?
Well, I'm really bullish on this technology for probably obvious reasons. That's why I work in this space. And I think that one of the big problems in philanthropy that I think reflects also some of the problems we see about bias in tech is one of accountability. Like, how do you actually track aid dollars and make sure that they're going to the intended recipients? How do you create measurable metrics that can be triggered for the inclusion of additional funding, for example? And how do you provide incentives for people to really do that? How do you ensure that there is traceability across the creation of new mechanisms for provision of aid? And I think even more than that, and then thinking about non-traditional philanthropy, what kinds of new economic and financial models can this technology actually unlock? So one of the things that blockchain technology can do is actually enable you to use digital assets in new ways. So we call this process tokenization. So if you tokenize a digital asset, that means you essentially can assign different kinds of value to it, and you can use that as a measure to hold whatever institution accountable. So one example, in addition to philanthropy, that we're seeing is in politics. I know you had an earlier panel on politics, but in the electoral process, there are opportunities to actually proxy vote with a tokenized asset, which means that there's more transparency and accountability in who cast that vote and whether it was actually counted. So you're not relying on some centralized system that you may or may not trust and that may or may not have the same incentives as you to actually account for where your vote went. which I think is really powerful when you think about what that could do for equalizing the playing field for women, minorities, and other disenfranchised individuals in the population.
You talk about it as the red pill in the matrix. Why?
Yeah, I think it's a little addictive. I think when you start thinking about what it means to remove the need to trust in a centralized authority, whether that's a government, whether it's a business, whatever it might be, and to actually have the ability to transparently view a system of record, like what that means is pretty profound. So one of the first things that got me really excited about this space is I'm actually on the board of the ACLU of Northern California, and we talk a lot at the ACLU about criminal justice, obviously. And one thing that got really interesting to me was thinking about evidence in court cases, right? And just the bias that we know happens in the introduction of evidence into a criminal justice case and how that's racially motivated in many cases. What if you could track that evidence through a system of record that was visible to the public or to the media? And there would actually be impossible to essentially change the record after it was created. It's really powerful in terms of what that could do, again, for people that traditionally have not been the empowered members of our society. So when you start thinking like this, it's a little like taking the red pill.
Ty, reading up on you, I came upon a stat that you cited that our brains receive 11 million pieces of information at any one moment in time. And of that, we grasp about 40 of those things. So what's happening? What's happening between the 11 million and the 40?
Well, really what you're talking about is the definition of unconscious bias, which is our brain's tendency and ability to process tremendous amounts of information based on patterns, but those patterns can include stereotypes. And our brain's ability to do this is actually fascinating and really needed. It's how we move through the world. But when you bring that same process into the workplace, when you take those patterns we see in society that we may have taken in from film, the media, the nightly news, what we've seen in our society, when you take those same patterns and stereotypes into the workplace, that's how you get bias in hiring, performance reviews, promotions. And so really what we want to do is develop ways to mitigate that.
So tell us about what companies need to do. Like, what's the diversity strategy? Just pull the veil back for us.
The solution in 30 seconds to all the unconscious bias in the world. Well, really, unconscious bias lets us know that our default mode of operating is fraught with bias. Business as usual will result in tremendous inequalities. So what a diversity strategy allows is for companies or organizations to be super intentional about the outcomes they want, to be intentional about a hiring process, to develop policies and programs or other procedures that give them the results that are more equitable than what a default process would have allowed. And so here's a great example. If you're not super intentional about your pay equity processes, you'll have women making about 70 cents to every man's dollar, and increased inequities if you think about women and other marginalized groups and trans women, the numbers are even lower. But a diversity policy might say we are going to analyze our policies around pay, we're going to use data and great statistical methods to really see what's going on here, and then correct the inequalities when we find it. So that's just one example, is really looking at every single touch point of the employee life cycle and coming up with a strategy or a policy or a program to create a more equitable process. And that's a lot of what we do here at Airbnb.
So tell us about resumes. Names on resumes, and how do we, as someone who hires myself, sometimes I hire people for my company. I'm not aware necessarily that I'm making any sort of judgment before I read.
A resume is a great example of just how unconscious bias comes into play in hiring. There's so much information on a resume that can trigger unconscious bias. So your name can indicate your gender or your ethnicity. The address below can indicate where you live and your socioeconomic status. The other clubs or sports you were involved in can also indicate socioeconomic status. And so there's so much information that can cloud a person's judgment. And so, again, a good policy is just adding a lot of structure and consistency to the process and say, when we look at resumes, we're going to have a checklist. We're going to have a checklist of the 4 or 5 most important things we're looking for in this role. And if the person has it, no matter what their name is, no matter where they went to school, if they have the 4 or 5 qualifications we're looking for, they make it to the next round. And so a lot of the things that we talk about around diversity strategy is really about consistency and fairness. You know, how do we consistently apply things and add structure? And what that checklist does is it helps your brain focus on the information that's not important. Focus on the information that is important and ignore the information that's not important.
So blind resumes.
Blind resumes is step 1. The checklist is even better because, again, it's not
questions and grading criteria.
Yeah. So really, a lot of the things we talk about in hiring process is really about structure. So you want competency-based hiring where people are asked consistent questions and evaluated on, the same competencies. Because blind resumes just remove the name, but if you look at my resume, for example, there's other indications about my identity other than my name. So removing the name alone doesn't solve the problem. And then eventually, I'm going to show up. Eventually, you're going to meet a woman of color. So you need other structures in place to help you mitigate the bias.
Does blockchain have anything to do with this? Like, is blockchain, yeah.
I was joking. I'm sure there's a collaboration somewhere in this.
I'm sure there is a startup that is working on this problem. I have no doubt about that. And I was actually laughing because my name's Sheila Warren. It's not a Indian-sounding name, and there have been so many moments when I walk into a room, and the double take is absolutely hilarious. And then people glance at my hand and see a wedding ring, and they're like, "Oh, you must have married. That's what the last name is." Which I didn't change my name. That's my name. So it's like this comfort level they have when they spot the ring. Like, oh, now it makes sense. Now I can box you into some. It's really funny. So love blind resumes. I'm a big fan of a process around that too.
When we're talking about what is the World Economic Forum, like for everybody in this room,
sure.
Yeah.
What is this thing? So the World Economic Forum is mostly known for an annual meeting that we hold every January in Davos, Switzerland. And that brings together world leaders who are presidents of countries and who are CEOs of big companies. And it's an opportunity for them to really get together in an environment that's focused on furthering the benefit to the world. So we've had a shift in the last year to technology, where we're really focusing on emerging technologies, because the hypothesis we have is that these new technologies, like blockchain, are really going to fall into old patterns. And those are old patterns that very much include bias, and we can speak as much as you want to about what it looks like for women in the blockchain space and how that is better and the same, and in some ways worse than in other areas in tech. But the hypothesis is that if we pay a lot of attention and we're intentional about how we craft policy around these technologies, blockchain, AI, IoT, drones, autonomous vehicles, these kinds of technologies, we have a much better chance of developing them into mechanisms for enhancing inclusion and improving society, as opposed to just new methods of wealth generation for the elite, which is what has historically happened in many cases.
Would we see the kind of corruption we've seen in our election process if we were all on a blockchain, on a digital currency?
This is an active theory in the space. So there have been a couple of really promising pilots looking at voting on a blockchain, both in the shareholder proxy context I mentioned earlier, but also in actual democratic voting. So there was a work done in West Virginia with veterans that was really focused on remote voting and how you could actually enhance their confidence that their vote was actually received and counted, which is a big issue. If you've been following the news, there have been a lot of concerns about early voting that was just being tossed for random reasons or postage or whatever it might be. If you can do that digitally in a way where you can prove that the vote was your vote using biometrics or other indicators, then you have probably a chance of having more voting, so people will be more likely to vote because it's easier, which is in and of itself a big concern, but also more accurate voting, and you'll get away from this like hanging Chad kind of opportunity, right? Which is not great for our democracy.
It's like online banking or something. Just pull out your phone.
I think that's right. That's
vote.
Right. Yeah. Now, there are a lot of issues with that, too. Like, it's complicated. Like, do you really want to hand over your biometrics to be able to vote? What does that mean? That may be okay in certain contexts and not others, right? So if you're in this oppressive regime, the last thing you want to do is hand over your biometrics and have people be able to track your vote. Like, that's deeply problematic. So one of the things that I say a lot when I speak on that topic is that we have to be really conscious of the context. And the concern, and a lot of times what happens is, you try to roll out a solution that works in one environment in all kinds of other places, and this is where the blinders get really problematic. If you're not actually thinking about the people in that particular context or environment, you risk doing a lot of harm.
So, one thing that you all have in common is you're all thinking on an extremely global level. And is the tide turning? You're dealing with women in developing countries that I'm sure are up against so much more bias just for being women than we are here. And the percentage here is so low as it is. 11% of executives are women in Silicon Valley. 11% of women are directors in Hollywood. That means the narrative is not going to be conducive to more women coming in. And the consumer base is overwhelmingly women, over the majority. So it doesn't even make any sense, really. But I digress. My question was, is the tide turning? Did Me Too and Time's Up do anything? Is it, what's happening? What about accountability here and abroad? Any one of you. It's a free-for-all.
Well, the first thought I had is I have to choose to be hopeful that the tide is turning. You have to have some element of optimism when you're in a diversity or gender conversation. And where I see it turning is the burden is moving from individuals, women, people of color, marginalized groups. The burden is moving from them to navigate an unfair system, and the burden is being really placed where it should be, which is on organizations to make their systems, their policies, and their processes more equitable. And that's one thing that I'm really excited about. It's not about training women to ace an interview process that was set up against them. It's about the companies having to put into place an interview process that is actually fair. And we can think of other examples of that. It's really the scrutiny is being shifted. So I think in some ways the tide is turning.
I would say that I definitely agree with that. What I've observed in the 60 chapters we're in 6 different continents, so we're working with so many different cultures and races and religious groups and just people of different ethnic backgrounds. They really need role models. They really need mentors, and I think that is really making a difference. We see more women and men coming forward to help the younger generation, providing them with skills and best practices, helping build their confidence, really sort of building more of, the women's equivalent of an old boys network, and really holding themselves accountable for the success of their careers or new and interesting opportunities, or getting them funding if they're a female founder and are launching a startup. So we see this huge transition and this huge change. Simultaneously, we're seeing more women take more risks. Like, we have a big presence in the Middle East and Saudi and Kuwait and Dubai and Jordan, Palestine, Israel. And that the shift that I've seen over the almost 12 years that I've been running Girls in Tech is groundbreaking. So we see a huge percent increase of women actually launching companies. We teach something called Startup Breakthroughs, which is our entrepreneurial training program. And we see every year we have exponentially more people. So we started out with 52 people, and now we have over 700 people. And that's a really big deal, because now not only are women taking more risks to be female founders, but there's more support. So their communities, the tech ecosystem really understands the value to the economy and educational opportunities. And the governments are actually interested in promoting women and having them, supporting them to have a voice within the community. So I could see that really changing not only the tech ecosystem and economic opportunities, but just human rights, social justice, things helping women get out of that oppression.
How about parity overall in terms of pay? You all have this living wage pledge to have all of the people that clean up be paid $15 an hour by 2030, right?
Yeah, it's really our company thinking about our sphere of influence. And so one of them is what happens within our own company and our own employees, and we do pay equity analyses regularly and correct those inequalities. And then it's our next sphere of influence, our hosts and guests in that community, and how we can be a part of some really great positive change there. And so one of that is the pledge that you just discussed, knowing that we can have influence there. We also think about the women who are hosts on our platform and making sure that they are getting the same nightly rates as men on our platform, and we do analyses there, and we see that we're close, very, very close to parity there. So we're looking at every place we have a sphere of influence and where can we espouse our values. And back to your early question, is the tide turning? Like, there's some really encouraging, promising numbers. I'm a little impatient, even when I am still optimistic.
And I think this is like the hugest issue, because in the blockchain space, we're actually seeing there are a number of, just phenomenal women in this space, right? And they've risen to prominence very quickly, in part because the call out is immediate. Like there are a couple conferences where it was like all manels, and there were like the strippers after the party, and it was just the call out from the community was instantaneous, and the backlash was huge, right? So that conference is never happening again. That would not have happened. I can't imagine that ever happening in my time on Wall Street, in my early years in the Valley. Forget it. But this community is really, it's to what Adriana was saying about this, the women coming together, and there's all kinds of, whether you're on Telegram or Signal or WhatsApp or WeChat, there is some group of women in blockchain that you can tap into that's really promoting and supporting women. But the pay equity issue remains. And even if at a junior level, you're achieving pay equity because everyone's graduating from the same schools and they're all kind of trained in the same fashion, you get the maternal hit, and you get the maternity hit. So you leave for maternity leave, and when you come back, there's just this gigantic sinking that happens that disproportionately affects women versus men. And that's used as an excuse to justify unequal pay, which is really problematic. It's very hard to come back from that, I think, for many women.
What can be done about that?
I think it's about intentionality again. I think it's about examination of how we, particularly in American society, don't support women, families, whether it's in the process of getting pregnant, which is very challenging, especially for hardworking people.
Big companies up here are paying women to freeze their eggs.
Starting to do it.
Do you get paid to freeze your eggs, or do you just get the cost of freezing your eggs paid for? I think that's it.
No idea.
Yeah.
Okay, yeah.
But it's major companies.
Yeah, I think there's a difference between being at really big established companies and being at startups. So it's this question of who do we empower to take risks in our society? And if you're a woman who wants to really bust hard, work really, really hard in your 20s and 30s, which many of us are more than willing to do, and you're kind of putting off some of these decisions, you're going to make choices around some of the option space that you see closing down for you going forward, right? Which is, again, these are all things that I think affect women disproportionately than men because of the way our society is structured around things like parenthood, family leave, et cetera. And I think what's promising to me is we're starting to see, we were talking about this actually backstage, we're starting to see a lot of movement of men to really call this out as well and to say, look, I'm also a parent. I also want to be able to have more breathing room in my career to kind of spend time with my family and all this kind of stuff. And I also don't think I should take a pay hit if I do that or whatnot. So.
Yeah, I think our conversation earlier was the things we put into place that will benefit women and mothers and people of color and other marginalized communities will make whatever organization, our society, better for everyone. So it's not a scarcity model, us versus them. It's really the equity we're moving towards is going to be better for everyone.
Just a quick note, I want to call out Mark Benioff because I think he's been doing a great job at this, and I have several friends that work at Salesforce, and he took his HR department and actually made a sort of micro division, and they did sort of an analysis and audit of compensation parity to make sure that all women were getting paid the same as their male counterparts for doing this exact same job. And I think it was like $3.5 million later, he was able to invest and keep his promise. So that to me is serious accountability, and I think a lot of other high-tech companies out there can learn from him.
So we have 2 minutes left. Is there a question? We have 1 minute left. It has to be the fastest question ever, or I'm going to ask it. So, oh wait, there is a question?
Thank you. Hi, my name is Brianna, and my question is, how do we continue to empower the women that we are surrounded by on the day-to-day, especially engineers, to continue to, strive to contribute to our companies and grow and do great things?
So I'm sure we could all answer this, but I definitely think mentorship, and I keep on mentioning that because that's directly affiliated with helping build confidence, holding oneself accountable to help that person move forward in their careers or education, and answer questions that they might have about career choices, difficult career choices, especially if you're a software engineer in a sea of men and don't know how to deal with certain situations that you're confronted with. So I think that those mentors help pave the path for these more junior engineers and help provide questions or answers to some questions that you might have.
We need to support each other. We need to come together. We need to call it out when we see it. We need to speak up and lean in, as our friend Sheryl Sandberg says. This has been just such an inspiring trip to San Francisco for WeTalk, and we're so grateful to Airbnb for hosting us, and thank you all. We're gonna I want to say we're gonna be at Art Basel next, so WeTalk Miami is next in December, and then we'll be at Sundance in January as well. So keep up with us at WeTalk Culture, and thank you to Dell, our partners, and Adriana, Sheila, Ty. This has been so great. Thank you so much for being here. I'm Andi Timoner. Thank you.